Cool.
Oh, nice. And even the Zoom controls stay on top.
Yes, sometimes. To this day, I'm still trying to work out what the developers of Zoom were thinking.
Money, I guess.
That's fair. All right, and we are at the top of the hour, so therefore we kick off the first session here at. Oh, we got a first question for you already. Where is your hat? We're kicking off the first session with SSDT SQL Server Data Tools Methodologies for SQL Server DevOps with our first speaker here at this edition of GroupBy Europe in track 1. And with that, Eitan, please take it away. If anybody has questions in between, please use the Q&A panel in Zoom, and I will make sure to ask these questions for you whenever we see that it fits. And with that, I'm shushing myself.
Cool. Thank you, Ben. So let's dive right in almost. So this is the session about SSDT methodologies for SQL Server DevOps. And the code of conduct for GroupBy was already mentioned by Ben. Just be excellent to each other and be nice. And the full code of conduct is available in this link here. Thanks to all the sponsors of this amazing virtual, how do I call it, like a conference? It's a conference, right?
Yes.
GreatGate, SolarWinds, SSG, and Minionware. Thank you. A few words about me. My name is Eitan Blumin. I work as a SQL Server consultant and DBA team leader at Madeira Data Solutions. We are the leading company in Israel, specializing in Microsoft Data Platform in general and SQL Server specifically. We provide professional services and managed DBA services and training services. I'm also co-hosting the SQL Server Radio podcast together with Guy Glanzer, also from Madeira Data Solutions. And you can see a few links and details on the screen. Right, so about this particular session. So first of all, I would expect and hope that whoever is watching this session is already familiar with the very, very basics of this world of DevOps, specifically what is an artifact, what is a CI/CD pipeline, what is source control, and so on. Just the basics. I don't need you to be a professional or well-versed in it, but just the basic terms so that I wouldn't be speaking over your head when I mention these terms. And this specific session focuses on best practices, sort of, and methodologies for SQL Server DevOps, specifically for SSDT from Microsoft. So first we'll talk about just a tiny bit about what is SSDT, and then we'll touch on the methodology itself, or rather what is the intended methodology that Microsoft would want you to best use this tool for. And then we'll touch a bit about common issues that are commonly found when using SSDT for database DevOps. And of course, how to solve them. So what is SSDT, or SQL Server Data Tools? First of all, it's free. Very important to mention this. It is a free tool from Microsoft. It is, in fact, a set of tools and projects or project types for Microsoft Visual Studio. It is also available for the free version of Microsoft Visual Studio, the Community Edition. So it is completely free. It is, in fact, also a combination of extensions and sort of like add-ons to Visual Studio. The most important of which is SQL Database Project, and that is the main thing we'll be touching upon as part of this session. The SQL Server Data Tools, or SSDT, like headline, if you will, also refers to the BI project types, such as reporting services, integration services, and analysis services. Those are nowadays installed separately as separate extensions, although they also like under the category of SSDT, if you will. We will not be touching upon those. Those are irrelevant to this specific session. And it also comes with sort of like utilities that come installed in Visual Studio, including schema and data compare based on Redgate technology. It also includes a refactoring tool, and it also includes unit testing projects for SQL Server databases. Important things to note. In order to, what I'm about to show you now is important to know if you want to indeed integrate SSDT projects, SQL Server Database projects into some sort of CI/CD pipeline. So what you would need to know is that in order to build such a project, you use the standard msbuild command to build the Visual Studio project. The artifact, the result of the build, is a DACPack file. And this DACPack file can be deployed to a target server, that target database rather, using the SQL Package command line utility, or using PowerShell, using libraries such as DAC services or the open source DBA tools. The unit test project type for SQL Server databases is the standard MS test. I mean, behind the scenes, it is actually the standard MS test project type for Visual Studio. It is nothing new. It's not a separate project type of its own. It has like sort of kind of like a wrapper thing in order to make it easier for DBAs to develop these unit tests. But behind the scenes, it is just a regular MS test project. Anyone who is experienced in the QA field should recognize it right away. And in order to run this MS test project, you use the standard MS test exe or VS test console command. How would you install this SSDT? So SSDT is installed as what we nowadays call a workload. You go in Visual Studio, you go to Tools, get Tools and Features, and then you see something like this, all these boxes. You scroll down a bit and you find the box labeled Data Storage and Processing, and that will include SSDT as well. Back in Visual Studio 2017, you could also install SSDT using the standalone installer. That was way back, so it's not really relevant nowadays, but that used to be also possible. Okay, so now that we know how to get it, now we need to know how to work with it. So let's touch a bit about SSDT methodologies. First thing important to know is that SSDT, or specifically the SQL Server Database Project, each project is supposed to represent a database. So all of the objects that are created within it are database scoped. These are database projects, and that is what we would save in our source control. There is some support for server level objects, such as logins. I think there's also a few other object types, but not all of them. Most of the server level objects are not supported. For example, jobs are not supported, but at least not natively as an object. And if there is some sort of dependency between one database and another, you could add both of them as separate projects in your solution and add something that is called database reference between them, so that one will be dependent on the other. And whenever you build this dependent project, the build will not fail due to reference errors because it references objects in the other project. That same would be relevant also for system databases such as master and NSDB, You can also add those as database references if your code includes dependencies for such objects. And you also and this database reference can be added several levels. You can add the reference for a database which is assumed to be on a separate server, as in linked server, separate database but same server, and same server, same database. You can actually split the same database into different projects and manage them separately. Each object, each database object in such a project would be saved as a separate SQL script file with the create command in it. More accurately, in order for SSDT to work, it requires that each object would be in its own batch. So theoretically, you could have one SQL script file with several objects, but it'll be okay as long as you have the Go keyword between them, so that the batches will be separated. Although if you have each object in its own file, it would be beneficial by allowing granular work and version history in the source control, because source control works by files. So if you have something change in one object, it will be very easy to track in source control if it is in its own file. In the database project, you can save only schema objects, not data. Although there are ways to circumvent that using something that is called a post-deployment script. For example, a post-deployment script is not, the build is not dependent on these scripts. They are sort of like free scripts, free-form scripts that you can write anything you want in them. And they would be, for example, post-deployment script would run after a deployment is completed. I'll detail a bit more about what is a deployment in a later slide, but it can include anything you want. And anything you want could also be a merge statement, such as the one on the screen, that sort of like makes sure that, for example, a lookup table has the exact values that we want. And this merge statement could be actually the way that we manage our data in source control. This is intended only for static data. This is important to note. You would not want to save here, for example, data of that represents something fluid as part of production. For example, customer accounts, or obviously not transactions, or I don't know, users, or whatever it is. You only want to save in source control static data where you want to make sure that it is the same in every environment where you deploy this project. If there is some kind of data that you want to make sure it is the same wherever you deploy your project, that will be what you would save in your source control in a post-deployment script. There is a store procedure, open source store procedure called sp_generate_merge. The link is at the bottom. That can generate such merge statements for you very, very easily. You just give to it the table name and a few parameters to tell it what you want, and it outputs exactly such statements to you, which is very easy to use. And then just copy paste it into your project and you're ready to go. So we mentioned that the deployment artifact of an SSDT project is a DACPAC file. What is a DACPAC file? Well, it is a compressed XML formatted file that contains basically a representation of your entire project, entire SSDT project, everything in it. Like whatever you've put in your database project, that will be the contents of your DACPAC file. As I said, it is deployed using the SQL Package Utility or using DAC services in PowerShell or DBA tools, which wraps it to make it a bit easier to use. And that is what will be used in CI/CD pipelines. Although there are some CI/CD platforms, such as, for example, Azure DevOps, it has some sort of task type. That wraps it around and makes it very easier to use. So there is a task type for deploying SQL Database Project, and it's much easier to use than obviously a command line or PowerShell utility. There are also other methods for you, other forms of deployment that you can manually perform. For example, you can right-click on a project, a SQL Database project, and choose to publish or build it. And when you build it, it can create a clean database creation script that within it includes drop a database if it exists and then create it from scratch, or just publish it from Visual Studio itself to a target of your choice. And you can also use the schema compare tool in Visual Studio, where the source is your project and the target is some kind of database that you choose. And then you can pick and choose which objects you want to compare and apply the changes that you need. And you can also, instead of publishing the project as is to a target, you can also just ask it to generate this publish script without actually running it. And you will get a SQLcmd script for you to use. You can review it, make sure that it does what you expect it to do, and then do it whatever you need. So a few words about SQL Package Utility, or whatever it is, that it's its compatriots like the DAX services, PowerShell, and the tasks in the Azure DevOps, or whatever it is you're using to deploy your DAC files. This is what happens. So for example, we are performing a publish of a DAC file to some sort of target. What happens first is the utility compares your DAC file to your target database using sort of like the schema compare tool behind the scenes. A result of that comparison, it generates a deploy or a diff script or a change script, which is meant to make the target database match that of the schema of the DAC file. And it does this using diff scripts. It doesn't drop and create everything from scratch. For example, if you add a column, it will run an add column command. If you change an existing store procedure, it will run an alter procedure command, and so on. It is a diff script. Then, for example, in case you're deploying to a new database, which doesn't exist yet, then obviously, first of all, the diff script would include all of the objects naturally, and the deployment, the final publish script will include create database command. Then it runs your pre-deployment script. Next, it runs the deploy script or the diff script generated in the second step. And then it runs the post-deployment script. And everything marked in white, that is what would be included in your final publish script. And I'm showing you this because it's important to understand it if you want to understand how pre-deployment scripts and post-deployment scripts work. So they are not part of the diff of the comparison, and the result of the comparison runs after the pre-deployment and before the post-deployment. And the diff, the comparison itself, is performed in the beginning as the first step. So for example, if you have something in your pre-deployment script that affects the target schema, that will not be taken into account when the diff script will be running next. And same for the post-deployment script. Another important thing to remember is that SSDT works using state-based deployment. As I said, the DACPAC file compares in deployment time the DACPAC file to the target database, and in real time generates the diff script for you. That means that the DACPAC file or your project serves as your single source of truth, and it represents your desired end state at a database level. So as I said, during deployment, the DACPAC file is compared against the target database, and the diff script is generated in runtime as a result of that, and then it is executed against the target to make it match the DACPAC file. This is in contrast to, let's say, the competing methodology of migration-based deployment, which means in migration-based deployment, you maintain or you manage diff scripts. You don't manage necessarily the end state. You manage each diff script separately, and those would be executed in sequence against a target database. So we have tools, common tools such as Flyway and Liquidbase and ReadyRoll from, I think its name was changed by Redgate recently, that those use migration-based deployment. There are ways to, let's say, bridge the gaps between them. Obviously, there are pros and cons and advantages and disadvantages to each methodology, and there are ways to circumvent those gaps. In the case of migration-based deployment, you can circumvent the gap using the SQL schema compare in order to generate your diff scripts. So that'll be easier for you to manage and maintain. But in deployment time, the diff scripts are what will be deployed as is. There will not be any comparison or of some sort in real time. The comparison would be done manually, and only the diff script as is will be executed. So, and in case of SSDT, which uses the state-based deployment, there are ways to circumvent that using, as I mentioned, the pre-deployment and post-deployment scripts. There's also the refactor tool, which is very, very useful to circumvent, to bridge the gap. For example, things that you can do very easily in migration-based deployment, but not so easily in state-based deployment. For example, what if you rename a column? So if you go and deploy the DACPAC file as is, just in the source project, you rename the column and that's it. What would happen during deployment time is that a SQL package will see, okay, I have column A here, I have column B here. So in order to bridge the gap, I guess I need to drop this one and add this one. Obviously, that is not what you want if you merely rename the column. The refactor tool can help you with that because one of its capabilities is to rename objects. And once you do that, the fact that you renamed an object is saved in sort of like a refactor file, an XML file, which is also saved as part of the DACPAC file. And when you deploy it, the DACPAC sees in the XML file that a rename operation was done. So it will do the rename properly using SP rename instead of dropping objects. The preferred way that Microsoft intends for you to use SSDT is called decoupled or isolated development methodology. That means that any schema development of the database should be done mainly using the Visual Studio project and not directly in a live database of some sort. Also, each developer should first and foremost work against their own dedicated local database in their local workstation, not a shared development database server. That is actually an anti-pattern, as it says on the slide. And now, obviously, hopefully, obviously, never develop directly on the production server, which is a lot more common than you think, unfortunately. And obviously that is the cause of many problems in the world of database. So using the decoupled methodology should avert problems that result from doing things like that, from problems resulting from working in the shared development database, problems resulting for working directly in the production database. First and foremost, your first line of defense, develop against the Visual Studio project. If you want to do like basic tests, then do it against your local host, your SQL Server installed locally on your machine. And I'm talking about the very basic sanity test. Obviously, there will be use cases when people need data in order to make sure that the database works right as expected. I understand that. You don't have to go that far. There are ways to resolve that, but you don't really have to go that far. Start with just making sure the deployment works and doesn't break anything, at least not severely. So you do that against your local database. And then when you commit your changes to source control, and obviously your project should be connected to source control, then behind the scenes, there should be some kind of continuous integration or build and release pipeline. And that pipeline would make sure that your changes don't actually break anything. And those checks would be done against, let's say, some kind of central integration server that would contain data. So let's say you have a pipeline, starts with some kind of integration server. All the changes would automatically be deployed there. And hopefully you have some kind of automated tests maybe, or maybe just basic tests or manual tests that would also be okay, I guess. And if everything is okay there, then someone would manually approve the next phase and would take the same DAC artifact and deploy it to the next environment, for example, test, QA, staging, and so on. Right, didn't forget anything. Okay. So I mentioned data, developing against data. There are ways to resolve that. For example, Redgate has a set of tools called SQL Provision. It includes tools such as SQL Backup, SQL Clone, SQL Data Catalog, and Data Masker. They are used to easily create images of entire databases, and then developers could use snapshots of those images to and work against them locally. So the developer is exposed in a way to all of the data that he can use during testing, but because they work against the snapshot, they don't actually interfere with other developers. And it's also very easy to manage. You can drop and create snapshots, refresh those images, and so on. It's a whole thing. I'm not going to go too deeply into that. SQL Provision costs money. Understandably, it's an enterprise-grade tool. It's very convenient, very easy to use, but it costs money. Not everyone would have, the ability to afford that. But there are also open source solutions that provide the same thing, although not as conveniently. There's DBA clone and DBA tools libraries for PowerShell. Those are PowerShell modules. So they can be used like in sort of like command line sort of fashion. They obviously don't have beautiful interfaces and so on, but they are open source, they are free. And if you don't mind the extra effort, you can use those instead. So to summarize, and after this, I'll take in questions. Every project in SSDT represents a database. Each object in a database will be represented by a separate SQL script file, preferably. The project could save only schema objects, like tables, procedures, functions, and triggers, and so on, not data, although there are ways to circumvent that using post-deployment scripts. The deployment artifact of the project is a DACPAC file. The deployment methodology of this DACPAC file is StateBased Deployment. And Microsoft intends for you to preferably work in a decoupled or isolated development. I can take in questions now if there are any about the things that we've gone through till now before we go into common issues.
So far, no questions. I will keep monitoring, and for the attendees, again, if you have any questions, please drop them into the Q&A panel, and I will ask them whenever it seems appropriate.
Excellent, thanks. Okay, I'll give it a few more seconds while I drink my water. No questions? Cool.
Nope, good to go.
Okay. Obviously, there are edge cases. There are abnormal deployment use cases that I will be honest with you, in some cases, it would be easier to deploy them manually instead of going through all the effort that you would have to go through if you want to use purely SSDT. I've seen such use cases whenever there's like a very complex change in the database schema. For example, if someone wants to normalize a table, something that's too complicated because you need many steps involved when normalizing a table. And sometimes I saw, whole very wide changes to schema, where we take this column from here to there and we change it from here to there, and this column needs to contain now the result of this column plus this one. And obviously, when you have such complex changes, it will be a real headache to do it cleanly using SSDT. So I would advise, you know what? Edge cases require edge solutions, or abnormal use cases require abnormal solutions. So you know what? For this time only, when you have this abnormal use case of yours, go ahead, manually deploy it to your intended production or whatever server, but do the same change in SSDT, in source control, so that you would have it there. Because once the CI/CD pipeline runs and it will try to deploy to your target database, as I said, it is state-based deployment. So in real time, it performs comparisons. When it sees that the end state represented in the DACPAC matches the end state in the actual database, it will not do any change. It won't do any effect. So it should be safe to do, granted that if you really do, the same change consistently in the database and in the project. Once they get to the same state, nothing will happen. It will be okay. With that being said, SSDT is still ideal for common daily development. As I said, these use cases I'm talking about should be at least abnormal use cases. You should try to avoid making changes to your schema that would require such complicated deployment scripts. For example, if you want to add a new column, try not to add it in the middle of the column list of the table, because SQL Server does not support that easily. To do something like that in SQL Server, you would have to drop and recreate the table. and SSDT knows that. So try to avoid it. If you want to add a new column, add it at the end of the column list. Your code should not depend on the order of columns as a best practice. That's just an example, right? But in general, try to do your changes so that they could be incremental and easily deployable, as opposed to, okay, I gotta rebuild the whole table now, because that will have severe consequences. We have, as I mentioned, we have a few tools that are at our disposal that can be used as solutions for lots of common problems. As I mentioned before, we have the refactor tool, can be used to easily rename objects. It can also be used to propagate that change across your entire project. For example, if you name the column using the refactor tool, it will scan your entire project and make the same change in all the functions, procedures, foreign keys, triggers, whatever it is you have dependent on this column. The refactor tool has a few other capabilities. It can also be used for fully qualifying tables. As in, let's say you have a select from table, then the refactor tool can be used to detect the schema of the table and edit the schema for it. And then it will be select from DBO dot your table, for example. And that could be very useful if you want to fully qualify your objects, if you want to apply schema binding, for example. It also can easily move an object from one schema to another. For example, let's say you make a change, you create a new schema, and you want to move a set of objects from DBO to that schema. You can use the refactor tool for this purpose. Choose an object, choose the new schema, and it propagates the change across your whole project. Database references is something that is very useful for when you have, as I said before, dependencies between your databases. If one database references or executes an object which is in another database, whether that other database is in another server or it's on the same server. And you can also use database references to split up one database. When you want to have, for example, this use case is very useful if you have replication. If you have replication, that means that once you do a change in one database, that change propagates to its replication subscribers, right? But those subscribers could have vastly different database schemas, and just those, the specific objects happen to be replicated. So you can create like separate projects in your solution. One would represent the publisher, and the other would represent the subscriber. And the subscriber, you just add the reference to the publisher, and then it will not break. If you make change, it grants you a few advantages. First of all, it allows you to have like a single point of maintenance. Let's call it like that. Okay, so if you have these replicated objects, you don't need to maintain two copies of it in your source control because you have two different databases. You can have them just in one of them. And once you deploy those changes to those objects to your publisher, replication should automatically propagate those changes to the subscriber, and you don't really need to publish them also to the subscriber yourself. You can also use database references for a same database. For example, if you want to have, let's call it modular deployment. Okay, I've seen those use cases as well. where people have their database schema in a source control, and they say, okay, we have this customer and they need this set of objects, that's okay. And we have other customers, they have, in addition to those objects, they have an additional set of different objects. And those additional different objects are not relevant to other customers. That's okay. Use database references, you can maintain those modular objects in one project dependent on the main project using database references, and you deploy different DACPAC files to different customers. It's an edge case, but I saw it happen. As I mentioned, you also have pre-deployment scripts and post-deployment scripts. Those can be used for all kinds of edge cases. Post-deployment scripts can be used for example, for maintaining static data, but it could be anything else. For example, I mentioned earlier, the jobs, SQL agent jobs, are not natively supported in SSDT. But you could write a script in your post-deployment script that would be responsible for creating a job if it doesn't exist. So you would be responsible for maintaining this code, but you can also have it as part of your DACPAC files in your source control. It would be very convenient. Yeah, okay. And there are also obviously pre-deployment scripts that you can use for all kinds of edge cases. For example, maybe you want to make some kind of data change before you actually start making changes to your schema. I know I could think of, for example, maybe you have like a global configuration table. You just flip a switch that says, I am now in maintenance mode. So now all of your sites go down because they check this flag. And then you run your deployment in your post-deployment script, turn it back up, and then your sites go back. Just, a random idea that I just said, okay? But it can be used for all kinds of use cases. I'm sure that you can think of some of those on your own. And if you require some kind of even more modularity or have your deployments more dynamic, you can also use something called SQLcmd Variables. In your project, you can create SQLcmd variables. Those that start with $ and parentheses, and you write the name of the variable inside. You can create such variables of your own and input a value for them. And those values can be changed per deployment between different deployments. So for example, you have, let's say, a stop procedure, which is dependent on another stop procedure, but in some environments, it needs to execute another stop procedure, or different stop procedure. Or maybe there's a stop procedure that has some kind of literal value in a string that needs to use for, for a filter or to update a field. But that value is different between different environments. You can have that value saved in a SQLcmd variable, and then its value provided during deployment. And speaking of differing deployments, you can also use publish profiles. And those publish profiles can save deployment settings that could be reused between deployments. And you can also have several such profiles. Each one would be used for a different deployment, maybe to a different environment. Questions so far?
Yes, a bunch actually. Let's start with a very easy one. Are we going to cover the SQL package as well?
I did in one of the previous slides.
Okay, sorry for that. And I've tried to clarify that question with the person who asked that. So if I'm asking that wrong, Alexander, please just clarify again. If you need DML to be based on metadata in table, So you want a metadata-driven approach. How could you handle this?
I'm not sure I understand the question. DML.
Yeah. Alexander. So Alexander, if you could clarify that maybe again.
Like, I mean, if you have as part of your deployment, you need to perform DML operations, and maybe the value that you use is different. That's what you mean?
The way I understood the question is that they have some kind of a metadata repository where they define all their tables and potentially views and other objects. And want to use that as part of their solution. Okay, so Alexander just got back. You have the table with data based on which other tables have to be, yes. So basically have a table that describes the tables that you want to use.
That I want to use for what? I'm sorry, I don't understand the question.
So you have a metadata table, and in that metadata table, you basically describe the tables that you want to have in your final solution. So rather than building out your table structure, why is a great counter question. How about that, Alexander? Maybe we take that discussion offline, and you just reach out to Eitan after that. Perfect.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So,
yeah.
Is it easy to take an existing database project and continue with the SSDT methodology?
An existing SQL database project?
Yes.
From where? From SSDT. SSDT is basically refers to the SQL Database Project in Visual Studio. That's what I call SSDT. And what I present here is the recommended methodology of how to work with such projects. So obviously, yeah, if you have an existing SSDT project, you will, yeah, obviously.
Excellent. You were talking about a couple of changes that you would rather have manually. So those changes were all those probably put anything with a potential data loss. So dropping a column, setting a column to not null, and adding a default, and so on. Since those are fairly common operation, would it make sense in your perspective to always use a change script assisted by SSDT as an artifact rather than a DAC pack?
That's a tough question, and the answer is even tougher because this is exactly what I referred as incremental changes. You need to change the way you develop your database in order to make your changes more incremental so that they would be easier to deploy. So for example, if you're used to adding not null columns, for example, without a default constraint, I would tell you, try not to do that anymore. Get used to adding them as null columns, and do it gradually, as small incremental steps as possible, in order to avoid this risk of data loss.
Okay.
And if you have, baby steps. So if you have such use cases that you know what, I don't have a choice because this is what the product needs. The application would not work otherwise. Okay, I understand. But these use cases have to be abnormal. You have to. What is the opposite of getting used to? Break your habit. You have to break these habits. If you get what I mean.
Okay. Don't make it a habit to drop your columns, I guess is the advice here. And I guess I agree to that. How would you version your databases with SSDT?
How would I version them? The same way you version anything in source control, because once your project is in source control, whatever you do with your source control, it doesn't matter because It can be any platform. It can be GitHub, it can be Bitbucket, Azure DevOps, whatever it is. So the platform of source control is the same as it is, for example, what you would use with your application software. So it doesn't really matter. It works the same way.
Okay. So Jiri here, I hope I said your name right, said, being a solitude database developer that mostly participates on existing databases from third-party vendors, so no control over the design of the database itself, there's probably not much use of this methodology for their self-made man projects. Where
Sure.
would you recommend them to start if they want to prepare themselves for being involved in this approach in the future?
Why would they? Because if you're talking about vendor database schemas, then obviously the vendor should be responsible for maintaining them. If we are talking about SSDT projects, I would assume that you are the one that needs to maintain the code, needs to maintain the schema. So I don't see much sense in using that for vendor database schemas, because if you are not the vendor, you're not supposed to be touching them.
Cool. And then Manish, come back here about that SQL package question. Are you going to explain a little more about SQL package.exe?
That's the same question. Well, I explained how it works in terms of, what are the steps that happen when you publish a database using SQL package. If you're talking about like other actions supported by SQL package, because it is a very strong utility, it has a lot more power than being used to deploy DAC files. But that's beyond the scope of this session. This session specifically refers to SSDT project, and SQL package is relevant to that because you use that to deploy your SQL Server project. But it has obviously other capabilities, but it's beyond the scope of this session. In Microsoft Docs, there's lots of information about it, about the parameters you can use, example executions, but that's irrelevant to this topic specifically.
Okay, perfect. Manish says, got it, thanks much. And with that, no more open questions. So back to you.
Excellent. So, okay, I already talked about this one. I need to remove this slide. What I want to say with this slide is that if you're using a CI/CD pipeline, most likely it has support. It can support SSDT projects because every pipeline platform, CI/CD platform, has support at least for command line utilities and PowerShell command. So if you have those, and I assume you do, you can use them for SSDT. Everything else is basically a wrapper, right? Because, for example, as I said, in Azure DevOps, for example, you have specific, a dedicated task for SQL Database Project. I'm assuming that with time, other platforms could also have native support for it. But even if they don't, they for sure have support for command line or PowerShell commands. And in such a case, you can use that to deploy your SSDT project. And on the screen, you can see links, relevant links to the MS build command, the SQL Package Utility, and the publish DBA DAC package commented from DBA tools, very, very useful if you have PowerShell. And in case of unit tests, you can go to the VS Test Console options documentation, and it's all the same thing, right? Everything else is a wrapper. What the important thing to do is speak with your DevOps team or person and ask them what platform you're currently using. Most likely, you would also be able to use the same platform. Okay, usually there shouldn't be any reason why not. And also look for Sander Stad. He made an excellent set of tools on his GitHub repository. For example, template files and template projects, sorry, that you can use with SSDT. Very useful set of tools. Very useful to get started. If you want to use scripting to deploy your project. Also, I'll refer to you to a few other very useful sessions on the topic. The Azure DevOps Duet with Kevin Chant and Sandra Starr, they delivered this session, I think, almost in any conference. And there are lots of copies not copies, but lots of recordings of the session available. Very useful to get started with SSDT and Azure DevOps. As I said, Sandra Starr has his own repositories on GitHub with templates and starter scripts. This is an excellent, magnificent session by Alex Yates called Zero Downtime Database Deployments. He delivered it a while ago at SQL Friday. Very useful session talking about development and deployment methodologies for databases that provide you with zero downtime, no downtime at all. This is a perfect session and perfect methodologies for enterprise-grade environments where you cannot afford any downtime. So that's very useful. Go ahead and find it. Also, the session, the slide deck would be available for download later, right? So you can also find the links there. And Andrei Zavetsky has a session about unit testing with SSDT. If you want to go deeper into that, he explains that very well. And also Microsoft documentation. There's Microsoft documentation about SSDT in general, about how they recommend working in decoupled environments or either project-oriented offline database development. And you know what? This is a trending topic, and more resources are created every day. And it's a trending topic for a good reason, because there's lots of benefit to implementing DevOps methodologies with your SQL database project as well, not just application software. Although I think we are out of time to go too deep into that. Time for any final questions?
So Victoria came back, who originally had the question, how would you version the database with SSDT, and clarified a bit. What they meant was how would you track the state of the production database? So for example, you made 5 changes and that sums up in a diff script, you apply that. Q&A wants to make sure that your production system is on the right version. So basically, how do you check which version has eventually and actually been deployed compared to what you want it to be?
Yeah, that's a good question. There is a feature called a data tier application in SQL Server. You can register a database as a data tier application. And once you do that, it saves like in a table, like in a sort of like a pseudo system table. It saves the version that was last deployed. And you can integrate your SSDT project with that feature, because every time you deploy from your SSDT project, it can be used to increment the version automatically, and it can also be used to detect version drift. So if, for example, if an object was changed since the last deployment, you can be alerted about that. That feature is supported in SSDT, like a checkbox. I think it's in the where you create publish profiles. There's a checkbox for that. You can set it up. So yeah, it is possible.
Okay, excellent. And Mikhail also came back. So who was originally asking about when to use the methodology, and clarified also a bit. So let's say they have an existing database in production, but that was not built with SSDT. Would you recommend moving that into SSDT and the SSDT methodology, or is it more something that you use when you're starting from scratch, but not afterwards?
No, you can use an existing database. It's okay. When you first create an SSDT project, you can right-click on the column on the project, and choose import. And then you can use that. It's like a wizard. You can use it to import an existing schema from a database. You can also use it to import a schema from a DACPAC file if you already have such a file. But yeah, sure, you can start from the middle. It's okay.
Okay, excellent. Do we have any more questions from the audience? I don't have any on the Q&A panel so far.
Great. So
there we got one. Manish came back. Using the MS Build utility, they create DAC packs every day, and then using the schema compare utility, they do the DB deployment. What is the best way to automate the manual comparison they do in schema compare to do deployment?
SQL package. I mean, the schema compares, I assume you're doing that manually using the Redgate tools, maybe. SQL package
like
does that. Yes, the SQL package utility does that automatically. As I mentioned before, you can use the SQL package command line utility to deploy DACPAC files. You said you have DACPAC files, you can use that to deploy them. And what it does is during deployment, it performs a comparison and then deploys the changes. So there you have it. You already have whatever you need. Or you can use, the PowerShell. If you're using PowerShell, you can use either the DBA tools module or DAC services. If you want to, customize it yourself somehow, I wouldn't recommend that. But yeah, sure, it's possible.
Cool. All right, last call for questions. And while we're talking about questions, coming back to your earlier question, Eitan, it was 47 attendees.
Ah, cool, thanks.
So I told you it would be more than the original 4.
I'm glad to hear that.
All right. With that, thank you so much for presenting for us, Eitan. Thank you so much also for the great question from the attendees. Eitan's contact details are up here on the screen if you need to follow up on something.
Yeah, we also have our own repositories on GitHub, my own personal repository and the repository from Madeira Data Solutions. You can see the links on the screen.
Excellent. And check back on the chat. There's some nice feedback in there for you. And from what I hear, we will not have a link for you to provide feedback immediately, but all of the attendees will actually get an email afterwards. So once you get that email, make sure to provide feedback for all the sessions that you're watching today. It is super helpful for all of these speakers. So with that, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, up to next time.
Yep. Now you'll be taking the screen share?
Yes, hang on.